Greetings, viewers. So this is a quick overview of Chapter 11 in my text, The Third Supercycle. And the title of this chapter is The Allied War of Resistance, 1941 to 1943. What I did for the last three chapters was that I subdivided the period 1941 to 1945 into more or less two sections. And the reason is that between 1941 and 1943, the Allied coalition is formed, but it's still finding out the strategies which will be effective to defeat the Axis. It's also mobilizing its industrial base, it's figuring out planetary logistics, it's figuring out planetary air power, it's figuring out planetary sea power. So this is the experimental phase. And then 1944-45, it sort of applies the lessons and basically finalizes the strategy and implements what it has learned in the previous period. Now, the basic story to this chapter is this chapter draws heavily in terms of material, on one of the very best texts ever written by World War II, and that is by Phillips Payson O'Brien. His excellent text, I do recommend, called How the War Was Won. And his basic argument is that the Allies fought a new kind of war in World War II, and specifically the British, but most of all the American army, fought really reinvented warfare in a new way. They thought of warfare as a planetary and technological phenomenon. And the basic innovation of the American army was to create what Payson calls the air-sea super battlefield, and that is to use air power specifically to create air hegemony in order to have striking power deep into the enemy's territory and to destroy their productive base. So the whole notion of Allied strategy was, instead of spending soldiers and equipment at the front line, you reach into enemy territory, its civilian territories, and you destroy its factories, you destroy the equipment as it's being produced or being taken to the front line. So you do the saturation attack at every level, from production to distribution to the front line, and overwhelm the Axis powers that way. Now, the United States implemented this strategy, as did the British. The Soviet Army did not implement this strategy to the same extent. The Soviet Army implemented what was really a variety of accelerated attrition, and that is essentially throwing numbers at the front line. And the Soviets did build a large number of planes, and they did contest the airspace on the Soviet-German front line. So the Germans had air superiority early in the war and then lost that by 1943. But for the most part, the United States really leads the way in terms of fighting the war this way. And the strategy is absolutely critical to the Allied victory. And it explains why the Allied victory, once the Allies start to mobilize, it happens surprisingly quickly. You have to remember that the Axis powers had been at war since 1935, trying to conquer the world, and they had expanded for about 7 years. Once the Allies start to mobilize fully, it takes them only basically three and a half years to fully mobilize and overwhelm the Axis, and that's because they're using this new strategy. The rest of the chapter goes into some of the details of this. One of the relevant statistics is that if you look at United States military spending during the war, 40% of it was devoted to airplanes and aircraft of all kinds. The United States would eventually end up building 299,000 planes, just the biggest airplane and airport construction spree in world history. They built hundreds of airports, hundreds of thousands of planes. Over the course of the war, the Allies would produce 75% of all the planes used in the conflict. The Axis would build only 25%. The Axis also had the problem that they didn't have enough fuel, and so they were very limited in terms of oil and raw materials. 30% of the United States budget was spent on naval vessels. And over the course of the war, the United States Navy would produce something on the order of 7,000 vessels of various kinds. The proportion of land equipment, and this might surprise you because most people think of World War II as tank battles and panzers and units at the front line, and it was a fully motorized war, but it was a war of fully motorized aircraft engines. That was the single most dominant form of technology which decided the war. Only between 15 to 20% of the total United States production was devoted to land equipment. Had been a little bit higher earlier in the war, but then they found they actually didn't need so much land equipment. They didn't need so many tanks. They weren't actually going to deploy as many ground soldiers they needed. So basically the Allied strategy is that you replace soldiers with technology and machines, and it worked very, very effectively. The second point about the mobilization, the United States plays a key role because it has the single largest economy. It would actually grow during the conflict to become approximately half of the world economy by 1945. And the United States was big enough and rich enough and had a deep enough industrial economy to actually do three mobilizations at once. The first and most obvious was the mobilization to defeat Axis Germany in Europe, to equip soldiers and equipment, materiel, and airplanes in the European theater. The second mobilization occurred in the Pacific theater to defeat the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. The third American mobilization was to produce the equipment needed for Lend-Lease, and this was to keep the British Empire but also the Soviet Empire in the fight and fighting against the Axis. And we'll go into the next chapter. We'll explain a little more detail about the importance of Lend-Lease in the course of the war. It was actually a critical component, but the thing is, the Soviets did do heroic deeds in terms of fighting the war, but they were only able to be heroic because Allied Lend-Lease gave them an enormous amount of equipment. This is something that the contemporary rulers of Muscovy do not like to talk about, nor did the rulers of the Soviet Empire, but it needs to be stressed. So the air-sea super battlefield is not a fiction of O'Brien's imagination, it's quite real. And I'll give you some statistics showing you just how important this Lend-Lease strategy, which was part of this strategy, was to the overall victory. Now, it's true that the largest concentration of soldiers fighting at any given time was on the Eastern Front between the Soviet and German empires. However, what is not widely recognized is just how important Lend-Lease was to Soviet war production. And nowadays we have fairly complete statistics, and what we know is Lend-Lease created or helped to create roughly 2/5, 40%, of Soviet aircraft production during the war. Extraordinary number. 14% were actual planes delivered via Lend-Lease. These were planes produced in British and American factories that were shipped overseas. But another good chunk was because Lend-Lease delivered large amounts of aluminum to Soviet plants, and also blueprints and drawings and technology and know-how and research materials and so forth. All those were made available during the war, mostly through spying or not necessarily legally, but they were made available. And this is just one piece of the Lend-Lease puzzle. 57% of all the trucks used by the Soviet Red Army were Lend-Lease. And this was extremely important because without these trucks, the Soviets are really limited to walking or to rail logistics. Speaking of rail logistics, the Lend-Lease supplies were 31% of all the locomotives and cars used in the war effort. So extraordinary. Even the locomotive network that the Soviet Army used, 1/3 of it, 31% comes from Lend-Lease. Same story with petroleum products. Obviously, the oil, a lot of the oil fields were in the south and the Soviets couldn't reach them because of the German occupation. So Lend-Lease stepped in. And we think about 60% of all the aviation fuel used by the Soviet Air Force was from Lend-Lease. Food production. 1/3 of all the calories consumed by the Red Army during the war were Lend-Lease food supplies. This was enormously important. This helped in two ways. Number one, it kept people alive and prevented mass famines. But the other story is, with that amount of calories feeding your army, the Soviet Empire did not have to devote significant resources to growing food. Otherwise, you have to put those people into farms and grow food. And then you can't man the front lines. You can't use your strategy. The Soviet strategy during World War II was essentially that of accelerated attrition, which is a fancy way of saying throw resources at the front line and hope you break through eventually. Just overwhelm the enemy through sheer numbers. It kind of worked at a very, very heavy cost in lives and materiel, terrible cost and human cost, but the managers of the Soviet Empire did not care about human life and just cared about victory. And so that was the strategy that they used. It could not have worked without Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease gave the muscle and the materials and the resources that enabled the strategy of attrition to function. The last two things that need to be mentioned. Lend-Lease also provided enormous quantities of raw materials for Soviet war production, particularly minerals and metals. We go down the list here. 13% of all the nickel, 26% of all copper, 42% of all aluminum for planes, 51% of all tungsten, and 65% of all molybdenum, which is very important for armor and steel and so forth. So this was an enormous slew of resources, and it was accompanied not just by raw materials. We think something on the order of 35,000 machine tools were also sent via Lend-Lease, and not really quantifiable, but large amounts of technical knowledge, engineering diagrams, drawings, blueprints, patents of all kinds. The Soviets literally sent a team to the patent office, and the Roosevelt administration allowed them to copy whatever they wanted in the interest of, defeating fascism, which is on the whole a good thing. But of course, they were going to use that to build up their economy after the war. So there was a two-way street there. The scale of this influx of resources from Lend-Lease was enormous, and economists have estimated that probably the influx reached something on the order of 10% of Soviet GDP in 1944-1945. And to give you a sense of how big that is, the total amount of foreign direct investment that flowed into the Chinese economy between 1993 and 1997, that was a key point where the Chinese economy was taking off, and it needed heavy investment in its industrial base. And where to get it? Well, FDI flowed in. That was about 5% a year over 5 years. So the total investment by Lend-Lease into the Soviet economy was roughly comparable. So it's probably 5-6% over a 4-year period instead of 5-year period. But it was absolutely critical to restarting the economy. And it was also critical for resetting the Soviet economy and enabling it to grow after 1945, when it acquires this vast empire in Eastern Europe and has to administer that empire in various ways. And it would use those resources in Lend-Lease to rule its new territories and domains. The last thing that the chapter mentions is one of the effects of Lend-Lease that wasn't widely understood at the time. It didn't just stabilize the Soviet Empire, enable it to resist the invasion, the Axis German invasion effectively. It also enabled the Soviet Empire to help support some of the other revolutionary movements that were aligned and allied with it. In particular, the Maoist and the Titoist party states of China and of Yugoslavia both received critical support and assistance from the Soviet Empire. And Lend-Lease, it's not that Lend-Lease was given directly to them, but the Lend-Lease aid stabilized the Soviet Empire, and that enabled the Soviet Empire to support these movements through a variety of means, both diplomatic, military, economic, etc., etc. This will be very important because these two movements become extremely important as templates for the post-1945 period. And politically, they become part of this anti-fascist coalition, and this becomes extremely important in all the countries of Africa and Asia after 1945, because they're going to see their struggle for independence very much in the terms of the Allied struggle against fascism. So there's a kind of a direct link there. Even though they're slightly different, the parallels don't work. They don't completely work. There are parallels, but there are also limits on these parallels. Point is, Lend-Lease has incalculably important effects in transforming the political landscape of the world. The last thing the chapter mentions is this issue of the political economy of how the war is fought, because the Allied strategy is not just a question of mobilizing resources, it's also mobilizing hearts, minds, souls, wishes, aspirations. And one of the things that happens during the war is that this logic of mobilization will have political consequences, and these political consequences really change polities from within. And so more change happens between 1941 and 1945 throughout the core polities and in many places of the world. More change happens in those 5 years than occurred in the 30 years previously, because of this kind of this dynamic of wartime mobilization, pressure, internal mobilization, and transformation of institutions. So I will stop there.